Thank you so much for coming, Harry. You're another guest on my Mudlarking with series, and I'm so pleased you have managed to join me. A quick background: I know Harry because you invited me to come and talk on your at your history festival at Chelsea, didn't you? Is the festival happening again this year?
Thanks, Lara. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's so nice to be on your podcast. Yeah, so the festival is happening this year, we hope, but given all the sort of uncertainty, it's in September, so hopefully it's a sweet spot where everyone wants to come and sort of get together at a history festival. We're just sort of trying to work out if we can do it. If not, it'll be mostly virtual. So I'm taking tips from this to see how best to do it.
Well, I'm on a very steep learning curve, but I really enjoyed the festival last year. It was the first one, wasn't it? It went really, really well.
Yeah, it went well, and it's a sort of collaboration between some of those institutions in Chelsea who thought, oh, well, let's put a history festival together. So it's the Royal Hospital, the National Army Museum, and the Chelsea Physic Garden. So it's a really nice, the Chelsea History Festival. Come along, everyone, if you want to.
No, it was really, really good. So I just wanted to start off with your book, Harry, because you're an author as well. And you've written a fantastic book that I've just finished reading, and I enjoyed it so much. Could you tell everyone just a little bit about your book? Hold it up if you've got it.
Got a copy, yeah. So I actually wrote. It feels like it was written by someone else. Now I wrote it about, I suppose, 4 years ago. It's called Anatomy of a Soldier, and I served in the military and was injured in Afghanistan. And this is a sort of fictionalized account of my own sort of route through the military and then being injured. And it's strange, I suppose, because it's told from the point of view of inanimate objects. So each chapter is a different object, and it tells the story of a soldier who's called Tom Barnes and the sort of all the things around him, and also the insurgents who were sort of involved in his injury. So it was a way of looking at what happened to me through a sort of another prism, and the objects range from sort of tourniquets to pint glasses, bikes, bicycles for the insurgents, an ID. You know, there's all sorts. There's 45 different objects. So it's sort of hopefully a different way of thinking about conflict, really.
And so personal in places. I know it's fictional, but how much of it was based on what you actually went through?
So in terms of, it's quite odd. I mean, when people talk to me about the book, they sort of say, oh, when this happened to you? And I have to say, I'm so sorry, that never happened. Or one of the chapters is my mother's handbag. And people say, oh, it must have been so tough for your mum. And of course it was, but she found out about my injuries in a completely different way to the way I write about it. But in a sense, it's pretty close to my feelings and thoughts about it. I just tried to fictionalize it because I sort of wanted to protect some of what was personal to me, but yeah. I've definitely sort of mined my own experiences for it. Yeah.
And did you find it quite therapeutic writing in that way? It was about you, but it wasn't. It was you were almost writing about someone else, but talking about what you went through, because what you went through was horrific.
Yeah. So at the time, before I joined the army, I went to art school and did a load of sort of creative stuff. And that was really what I wanted to do. And then I sort of ended up falling into the military. So when I was writing, I was very much, so this is a creative challenge. I'm really enjoying this. And actually writing from the point of inanimate objects is quite a crazy, weird thing to do. So in that sense, you know, when I woke up in the morning and thought, you know, I'm going to be a Persian rug today, finding out how it was made and then writing a sort of chapter from the point of view of a Persian rug was really, you know, it was really just a creative thing. But I think when I got to the end of the book, it was quite cathartic. But I think probably writing and, you know, printing out 90,000 words for the first time, you know, that's quite cathartic for anyone. I mean, I think, you know, but it wasn't therapy for me. I mean, I've never had post-traumatic stress or anything like that. I've been lucky in that sense. But it's more a way of sort of ordering my thoughts about conflict and where I'd been, because I wasn't sure I sort of understood the whole reason why we were there, or war, or the people involved. So it was a way of thinking about it, I think, more than a sort of catharsis. It was more a sort of personal investigation into where I'd been and what happened.
Because you also follow the story of the insurgents, the people who set the bomb that injured your character Tom, Captain Tom. Do you think about the men that set the bomb that blew you up? It seemed, I found that not unusual, but that must have been hard to write about that, was it?
Well, I mean, that's one of the reasons that the whole thing is fictionalized, because I wrote about the imagined insurgents. So if I was going to write something very fictional about them, then I had to sort of fictionalize the whole thing.
Yes.
The reason I wrote about the insurgents, I think mainly was because I saw a lot of media and things when I came back that seemed quite angry, and it was sort of our boys and the horrible Taliban and this sort of very unfair way of fighting a war where you plant bombs underground. Mm-hmm. And as a soldier, you know, those IEDs were no less fair than a drone at 10,000 feet that drops a bomb. And when I saw these young guys, even younger than me, in markets and out in the fields in Afghanistan, and I knew pretty much that they might, you know, later that night do something that they shouldn't be doing that would hurt us, I couldn't help but think that they were no different from me. They'd just grown up in a different country and different background. You know, and we talk about the enemy being brainwashed, but I went to, I mean, this is pretty controversial thing to say, but I went to Sandhurst. You know, it's just a different type of brainwashing in a sense. And, you know, I'm not sort of trying to make excuses for them, but at a sort of human level, you know, it's far more complicated than lots of people think. And that's why the book, it was quite important that I tried to write it. And for instance, the word Afghanistan is not in the book anywhere. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of meant to be this sort of quite sort of, not abstract, but it's meant to be any sort of insurgency, I suppose. And yeah, so I think it was more about that. It was more about sort of you know, what is it to try and put yourself in the shoes of someone on the other side? And actually, when you do that and you really use your imagination, although there's things you might not like that you see, you can't help but find the humanity in them, I think.
Yeah. It completely humanizes war on both sides and on all levels. It just makes it so. I mean, the fact that you use all these very everyday objects like a bed or even a catheter. I mean, it's sort of it looking at something so complex through such simple objects. I thought was such a brilliant way of looking at it, and kind of a little bit about like the way that I've, you know, completely different subject, obviously, but the way that I've written about the river through objects, and I've actually find my subject easier to break down into objects because it's such vast subjects, you know, 2,000 years of history. If you can break it down by objects, it just makes it kind of easier to cope with. So did you find that breaking down war and just the whole complexities of what happened to you and what's going on in the world, breaking it down into these small, ordinary everyday objects, did you find that it made it easier to write about?
I think at a sort of, I don't know if it's technical, but at a sort of technical level, it sort of chunked it up quite nicely for me in a sort of creative writing way. But more sort of in terms of pulling the story forward and what it meant. You know, as a soldier, the objects around you are so important. I mean, they're important for lots of professions and lots of people in different ways. But there's something about sort of, if you put your body armor on, you know, that's the thing that protects you from the enemy. And then you have to get given a rifle, and that's the thing that allows you to go out and potentially do harm or protect yourself. And those objects sort of get scuffed and scarred, but they start to have meaning in themselves. And it's also the same in the sort of medical realm. You mentioned the catheter, but all those things that you sort of, you know, in a sense, being a soldier is dehumanizing in a way. You know, war is dehumanizing, but so is sort of being in a hospital bed in intensive care when you've got pipes and tubes going into you. Your sense of self gets very sort of altered. So to use those sort of points of, I sort of thought about them as points of experience. The objects aren't really meant to have personality. They don't speak. They don't have a voice. They're sort of points of experience. Was quite an interesting way for me to look at the story. And yeah, it was fun, actually. It was really fun, you know, to write from the point of view of a bullet, you know, leaving the barrel of a weapon was fun, you know.
Yes.
How far is it going? What's happening to it? So yeah, it sort of allowed me a way into the story that and because I didn't want to write another sort of war story, sort of, so, you know, injured soldier returns story, and I didn't want it to be politicized too much. I didn't want people to sort of say, oh, well, was there a good enough equipment, or were you look, you know, what were the, you know, what did you feel about the situation? Although I got some of those questions, I wanted to sort of have a way of being outside that. So I think that was one of the main reasons.
Mm. So Harry, you moving on to the river, you are a man of the river. You do spend time on the river,
Yeah,
don't you? You're a rower.
well, I kayak. Yeah, I kayak. So yeah. I've kayaked on the river for 10 years.
Right.
So when I should probably explain, when I was injured, I lost both legs. So I'm a double amputee. And after I was injured, you go through a very long rehab. And a lot of that in the army is focused on the physical side of it, getting you back to as much the sort of physical activity as you can, so that then you can go sort of and live a normal life. And I started running, but it was very painful for me for lots of sort of medical reasons. So sort of looking around for something that could replace the sort of physical activity and how keeping me fit, essentially, which was quite important to me before I was injured. And I live in sort of southwest London, quite near the river, and used to cross the river every day, and saw people kayaking. I thought, I wonder where they're kayaking from. And so there's a little local authority centre in Cremorne Gardens, which is, it's actually where Whistler painted the rocket from. So it's just in Chelsea. There's a local authority centre there that does kayaking, and I went in there and I paddled twice a week on the river every week for 10 years. And it's, without being too sort of emotional about it, the river essentially changed my life. I know it really well now. It's my sort of freedom. And when you're wearing prosthetics for 12 hours a day, and that's the way you move around, it's quite a sort of, it's a bit of a prison. They only go one speed. They're quite painful. They sweat. Now the weather's getting hotter. It's pretty unpleasant. But when I get into a kayak and take the legs off, I'm the same as anyone else. Floating. So it's sort of my way of getting freedom. So I love the river and its history and the sort of atmosphere of it. You're sort of in London, but I mean, you describe it so well in your book. But that sort of sense of being in London, but also not being in London, it's sort of this different realm, especially when the tide's at different heights. It's yeah, I love it.
And it's so powerful. Excuse me. It must feel so much more powerful. I've never kayaked on it, but it must feel so powerful and free just being on it and floating with the tide. I've watched the kayakers sometimes with great envy, so I must do it one day.
Yeah, you have to come out. Yeah, I mean, it's when I suppose which is probably always a recipe for disaster, but I'm quite used to it now. I feel sort of quite confident on it. But when the tide's really going under some of the bridges, especially around Westminster and places like that, it can go at sort of 6 knots under some of the bridges, which is just about you can just about kayak quick to get back through an arch. But when there's a bit of wind against the tide, which means you get these sort of choppy waves, it can be pretty hairy place to kayak. But then at other times, it can just be pretty tranquil and dead flat. And
at the moment, it's like a mill pond, isn't it? It's absolutely flat. It's a pancake.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing is you sort of see a bit of wildlife as well. I mean, there's a seal that keeps coming up towards Hammersmith Bridge and things like that, and it's just lovely to see that every now and again, and all the birds. And I was on Saturday, I was kayaking, and I was kayaking next to a friend of mine called David, and a fish jumped onto his boat and then sort of flopped off. So there are fish in the Thames.
Oh, well, at least you don't have to shoot the rapids under London Bridge anymore. Can you imagine doing that?
No. Yeah, I mean, because it had 16 arches, didn't it? I think
it did, and it slowed the whole tide down enough for it to freeze over, and that's why they had to build Richmond Lock and Teddington Lock, because when they took it down, it drained away completely, and they couldn't actually take any boats any further up. So they had to create these artificial locks to try and keep the water upriver. But yes, it was lots of people died, and I sometimes wonder how much of the stuff I find came off the people who came a cropper, trying to shoot the rapids through the piers of Old London Bridge. But when you're on the river, do you sometimes think about what's underneath and what's in there, what you're kayaking on?
I mean, all the time, because there is a sort of certain, as great as there's a sort of murkiness to it as well. You can't see through it. I mean, it's the silt and the way it sort of churns up. So, and it sometimes smells a bit, which I know you describe in the book very
Especially
well.
up your end, yeah.
And of course, I'm always thinking about more, I suppose, the people who've used it as a sort of profession, and the fact that it used to be far more used by the sort of lightermen and, you know, essentially the river taxis in the past, that ferried people up and down. And I think, you know, the sense that people were always dropping things or falling in and things like that. So I think, yeah, it's always I'm always very aware of the fact that there's this other world underneath, and sometimes when we come in at low tide, you know, where, because you're sitting down, you're very close, and you know, just pick up a piece of pottery and throw it back and there's always stuff around, especially where we get out at Cremorne Gardens. I think it was quite industrial around there, so there's always sort of iron bits of old machinery, and there used to be it looked like an Enigma machine, but it was just a typewriter,
Right.
with big old ones that just used to sit there, and you'd see it at certain times of the tide. Yeah.
And of course, you know, going back to sort of war, London has been quite a violent place throughout its history, and a lot of this is evidence in the river and in the walls as well. I don't know if you've noticed, there's that big part of the wall near the Houses of Parliament where a bomb landed, and they had to quickly rebuild it. There was a whole team of people ready to rush out and rebuild the walls as quickly as possible, because apparently the Luftwaffe were aiming at the walls, trying to flood London just to make life even more dreadful for the people in London. And there is, you can actually see the big splat basically in the wall, and all the old masonry on the foreshore there just missed the Houses of Parliament. But also in the river are evidence of warfare. So I'm now going on to the next section of our chat, and this is when I go into my river Cabinet of River Curiosities. And before we go on to the thing that we're really going to talk about, I have pulled a couple of things out that I found in the river, and the objects that relate to soldiers and war. Probably the oldest thing I've got is it's an ivory chape from a sword scabbard that would have belonged to a Roman auxiliary soldier. And that's around 2,000 years old. I didn't get that one out. I'll see if I can find it. Hang on. I've got to find my Roman. Here we are.
Did you know what it was when you found it?
I did, yes, because I found iron ones and copper ones, but never one that was made of ivory. And it's only the second complete one that's been found in this country. And it's in, you know, perfect condition. It's been recorded by the Museum of London. But to think that has, because the auxiliary soldiers didn't come from England, because they posted people from other parts of the empire. Otherwise, they risked mutiny, and they also wanted to spread, you know, the whole Roman thing. So they were sort of intermingling with the locals. So he would have come from somewhere else, completely miles and miles and miles away, dragged up to our miserable, damp little island, and probably made to go, and I don't know, maybe he went up to Hadrian's Wall and protected it from the barbarians up there. So that's the oldest thing I found. Then of course there's little, I can't hold these up, they're too small, but little pieces of medieval mail. People call it chain mail, but it's really called mail. The little links that it individually riveted, and they're beautiful. And then fast forwarding through to the Civil War, there's of course musket balls. Find lots and lots of musket balls. In fact, I'll send you one if you want one. And this is a powder cap. So it's the top of a powder flask. You know, when they had bandoliers around there, they would have had one of these on top of there. So that's Civil War. So that's 17th century. And then, of course, the World War, the Second World War particularly left a lasting effect on the river. And you find bits of these are the bands from around anti-aircraft, I think. And then also on the estuary, you can pick these up by the score. They're the fuses off the end of anti-aircraft missiles. I believe that's what I've been told. This one's been blue.
Yeah, when I'm kayaking through, particularly, there's a number of bridges, but the one that always, there's a lot of bomb damage on, I think it's Chelsea Rail Bridge, as you go through. And it always makes me think, you know, that you sort of forget that London had a blitz that 40,000 people died in, and what that must have been like. I mean, we're living through strange times now. Well,
the thing that we're going to talk about, and you know about this, and you have connections with the National Army Museum, and that's where this object is now. So I can't pull it out. Unfortunately, I didn't find it. Another Mudlark found it, and it's now with the Army Museum, which is the best place, by far and away the best place for it. And it is a Victoria Cross, which is incredible that someone actually found one, because very, very few have been handed out. And this Victoria Cross was found, I believe it was found at Putney by a detectorist. And for a while, they weren't sure if it was a real one, but it's had various tests, and it is a real one. Now, on the back of the cross is a date, and it's the 5th of November. Oh, let me just, 5th of November, 1854. Now, because it's missing its ribbon and it's a suspension bar, that would have had the name of the person who it was awarded to, and because that's missing, we can't be absolutely sure who it was awarded to. But we do know from the date that it was given out to somebody who fought at the Battle of Inkerman in the Crimea War, and 16 VCs were handed out for bravery during the fighting, and 2 of them are missing, unaccounted for. Now, they've managed to track down the 2 people who were awarded them and the missing medals. And there was one man called, his name was Private John McDermott, and he was awarded his medal. When he left the army, he spent some time at Chelsea as a pensioner, and he eventually died of typhus in Glasgow in 1866 in extreme poverty. The man they think, though, was probably the recipient of this particular medal was a John Byrne. Now, you probably know all about this, but I'll give everyone just a little bit of a history, and then we can have a little chat about it. Now, John Byrne, he came from a very poor Irish family. He joined up when he was 17. It was probably his only real option at the time. And he wasn't the world's best soldier. He was in trouble quite a bit. He ended up in prison at one point, but he fought very bravely in the battle. He saved some people. He had some hand-to-hand combat, and he was awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions at the Battle of Inkerman. And he also got the Distinguished Conduct Medal in New Zealand. Now, he spent 21 years in the army, and when he left, he ended up working for the Board of Ordnance. And by this time, it seems that his life had gone quite awry, because he was standing with his work fellows one day. It's said that somebody disrespected the Victoria Cross, and he pulled out a gun and shot the man in the arm. He then took off, pursued by the police. He ran back to his lodgings where he was staying, and the police surrounded him, and he shot himself in the head. It was all went through the courts. There was evidence given. That's how we know so much about it, because of all the evidence that people gave. It turns out that John Byrne spent some time in what they called then a lunatic asylum in Malaysia, which suggests that he was suffering from some kind of, well, obviously mental illness, possibly post-traumatic stress. He ended up in extreme poverty, like poor old John McDermott. He didn't fare well once he left the army. He was buried in an unmarked grave in Newport, which he's since been given a gravestone, I believe. And how this medal ended up in the river, nobody knows. It's anyone's guess. You've presumably been given medals for your service in the army.
Bravery, though. I just got the ones that came with the rations. Yeah, so I mean, it's just such an amazing story, really. That's firstly that we can sort of. I mean, I think there's sort of 1,500 VCs have ever been given out, maybe a few less than that. Like, I don't know the exact numbers, and I think, now I remember, because we used to have to write citations. I was an officer, so at some point during our tours, I went to Iraq and Afghanistan, and towards the end, so the chain of command would say, right, we need to write up people for awards for either sort of good conduct or bravery. So you'd sort of think about who had done things that were brave in your particular unit, and then you'd write a citation, and that would go into this very sort of long process of sort of, right, who, what level are these, how brave have these people been, what sort of awards could they get, and then I think there is a sort of a little bit of a quota in terms of, well, each battle group can have this many. I mean, I'm not sure it's quite like that, but there's certainly, you can't give out too many. You can't sort of you can't, you know, the award need to mean something. But I think of when I mean, I haven't read this anywhere, but I remember somebody telling me in the army that a VC had to be 90% chance of death in order to be sort of eligible for it in terms of the act of courage. You know, that was the way we were told to think about it. But I think through the history of the VC, the how it's been awarded has sort of changed slightly over time. In the Crimea, it was invented, it seems like the Crimea was the first conflict where they had telegram. They had these sort of undersea telegram wires, so they could get news back to Britain quite quickly. And also, it was the first war that had proper war journalism and the first early photography. So it was much more sort of public war, essentially. And I think it was Queen Victoria and Prince Albert who decided that they would, they were very key to this idea of having a medal that could commemorate acts of valor, because we didn't really have them before then. Mm-hmm. Other ranks, so people who weren't officers, were either given money or promotion, and there was a few different sort of awards for officers. But the French army had the Legion d'Honneur, or I probably pronounced that wrong, which was from the I think it was 1805 that came in, which was for any rank and was for extreme bravery. So that's why it sort of came in. And I don't want to say it was a sort of marketing tool, but there is something about the sort of conception of it, this idea that the VC was a way of sort of celebrating this war. And I think throughout any medal and any conflict, there has been a slight idea that the chain of command might use medals in order to highlight different bits of the campaign. Mm-hmm. The sort of unbelievable bravery that some of the people who were awarded the VC needed to show. Mm-hmm. And actually, when I look at the soldiers that I serve with, often the ones that were going back to Bern, some of the characters that I served with were a nightmare when you were at peace and in camp. It was so hard to sort of look after and make sure that they weren't getting too drunk or sort of drink driving and things. But as soon as you went to Afghanistan, often they were the bravest, the best, looking after everyone else. And I think when the VC first came in, if you sort of did something wrong, you could have it taken away from you.
Oh, really? And
actually, it was Prince Albert said, no, even if someone is hung at the gate, hung for, they should be able to keep their VC. And there's lots of myths around it as well. When I was in the military, very few, in fact, I think there was only one VC. There are 3 VC winners, 3 from Afghanistan and 1 from Iraq. And which just puts into context the sort of difference in the nature of warfare. And there's been 85 awarded since the Second World War. So of the 1,300 odd that have ever been awarded, only 85 have been awarded since 1945. But there's these myths about the fact that you had to sort of salute the VC no matter who you were. So a general would salute a private soldier if they had a VC, because you're saluting the honour, not the man. And if at the investiture, that's when it's meant to be the monarch gives the VC to the recipient. The VC always goes first before all the knighthood. So when Johnson Bahari, who was awarded his, he was the only Iraq War recipient of the VC. When he was awarded his, the head of the army at the time was being knighted, and Bahari went first, and then the head of the army went. Good. So it's just they're amazing things, these awards. And the other thing to say, in my experience, was that often people would receive an award, and it would be for a group of people, for their unit. So the military cross often was given to a sergeant or a section commander as a sort of recognition of a group event. But with the VC, although that can happen, it's mainly for sort of acts of individual bravery and valor. So yeah. So
each VC is made from the metal from a captured cannon, so it has this specific makeup, I suppose. I've heard, and I'm not quite sure, but during the Second World War, they were made out of a different metal. So there was just a short amount of time where they were made out of a different metal. But they could test these, and they tested them against the I suppose 14 VCs that they know existed from the battle, and they've tested the metal of this one just to make doubly sure that it is, because they did, sometimes people did lose them, and they would give them another one. That maybe, I don't know, but if it was made of different metal, it wasn't an actual because there's not much of this metal left apparently from this cannon. So this is definitely a VC. Nobody knows how it's ended up. Why is it in Putney? I mean, inserting yours, if you can, this is a lot to ask, but inserting yourself into the mind of, let's say it was Private Byrne, and somehow maybe he came to London briefly for some reason. He was in London. He had his VC with him. Inserting yourself into the mind of that man, how do you think it might have ended up in the river?
Well, I think when you receive any sort of award, it can be double-edged, can't it? And I think maybe for people who, and I've seen it in some soldiers that I've known, when they've received an accolade for something that they don't necessarily feel they did anything differently than anyone else would, or in a military action where in some way people were killed or died, or there was a lot of suffering. Sometimes your relationship to that time or that action might not be straightforward. You know, it might not be this glorious moment for you. It might be something very different. So potentially, I mean, putting words into, potentially it wasn't a straightforward good thing for a lot of the VC winners. It had a lot of baggage associated with it. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine somebody throwing, it might be into the pub or something, but throwing something that has a huge amount of sort of weight to it, throwing it into the river in a fit of rage. I mean, we all know the amount of things. You in your book, you talk about wedding rings that have been thrown in, or engagement rings that have been thrown into the river. And I think maybe it was along those lines, or maybe after he died, somebody thought, well, the best place for this is in the river, and somebody who knew him took it down there and threw it. Who knows? I mean, we can speculate, but it does. I suppose it feels odd to think that you would throw something like that into the river, something that is so rare and has so much meaning attached to it.
Yeah, but it can be a great release to throw things. The river has this power. It's moving. It does take things away. It could be something as simple as he might have sold it just for some food. He did fall on hard times. He could have pawned it, sold it just for a meal. He could have been so drunk he lost it, or it could have been stolen off him. I mean, we'll never know, will we? But
there's so many. I mean, I think the most, I think VC has made £400,000 at auction. Wow. And now I don't know when it came in, but there was you got a sort of yearly pension, and you still do with it. I think it's £10,000 a year. So that came in at some point, and I think it was after, it was sort of in the 20th century it came in, the sort of this idea that you got to do a yearly annuity. So I don't think we're ever going to know, but I just wonder if it wasn't, that idea that this wasn't such a positive thing for him, and if you have PTSD or you've been to a lunatic asylum, and I think he went on. Did he go and fight in New Zealand? And I mean, he had quite a long career in the army, and I know from friends of mine who have won these MCs and other awards that often it can change the way your career goes a little bit. And certainly a VC which is so rare, that can often have you're the person that everyone looks at, and that can be difficult, I think. Yeah.
Well, we'll never know. I mean, there have been other medals found in the river, and I'm sure there's more there to find, and each one has just a fascinating history and a fascinating human. There again, it humanizes warfare, doesn't it? I think these sort of stories of lost and found very personal objects. Harry, thank you so much. You've been great.
It's been really fun. Thank you.
I love talking to you. We had such a great time at Chelsea.
Yeah, well, we'll have to go and you have to come and kayak on the river sometime.
I'm gonna. Yes,
We'll go out
definitely. I'm
and
gonna have
paddle.
to give those rolls, am I?
No, we'll go out in one of those big doubles, so I can paddle and you can. We'll both paddle, but you could be. Then you can show me where the good spots are to go mudlarking.
Let's do that. I want to see Vauxhall Bridge, my favourite bridge. I want to see the ladies from the river. Yeah.
But you don't want to hang around too long because the cameras on MI6 start to sort of turn. Then
okay.
someone comes out and has a look at you. What are you doing down there?
Okay, right. I'm in your hands. Thanks a lot, Harry.
Brilliant.